All right, well, Job's friends, miserable comforters, they accuse him of wrongdoing to support their notion that God always blesses the good and destroys the wicked. Okay? Simple. It's really simple theology. You just say, if you're good, God will bless you. If you're bad, He'll kill you.
But in some of the Psalms it even says that.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Proverbs, it says it several times. Some say, well, you have to wait till you get to the New Testament to have all of that straightened out. No, you can read the Psalms. The Psalms are absolutely loaded with that ambiguity, the idea that, okay, God blesses, but how come this is happening? My God, why have you forsaken me? That's right out of the Psalms too, so.
I just think, it's the rule, it's not every time, but it's
Right.
the general rule.
General rule, right,
General rule.
right. That's correct, that's right. So they accuse him of wrongdoing in order to support their notion that God is just to the good, blesses the good, and curses the evil. So, and that's pretty much the story. Now, Job argues with his friends. He argues with his friends about the reasons for his suffering. Worse, Job questions God's perfect justice. I hope you didn't miss that, but I'm going to take you back to it because in Job 9, listen to the words of Job. We're going back in a few chapters. Even if I summoned him, Job is speaking of God. Even if I summoned God and he responded, I do not believe he would give me a hearing. Oh. Oh.
I think anybody would get to that point.
Verse 17, yes, he would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason. He would not let me catch my breath, but would overwhelm me with misery. If it's a matter of strength, he is mighty. If it's a matter of justice, who can challenge him? Even if I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. Even if I were blameless, it would pronounce me guilty. Although I am blameless, I have no concern for myself. I despise my own life. That seems to be a lot of what he talks about throughout. I just hate my life. And I think Job gets painfully close to slandering God here.
He's having a pity party.
He is. And that's really, emotionally, that's what's going on. He's very upset. And who would blame him? He's lost everything that mattered anything to him. So Job asserts, well, he's not been fair with me, and he wouldn't be fair with me if I called him down because I'm being treated unjustly now. That's kind of the way to the thinking of that. So of the many things that Job said about God, those verses are probably the most dangerous, okay? The Lord speaks now. Now we come to this point where we've had all this debate. We've looked at it looked at this issue in every way possible. 4 different guys looking at one fella and accusing him of wrongdoing. By the way, I did some more reading about Elihu. Remember the lone guy that we talked about last time? And there are some writers who think that Elihu is the only one that had it right. I would dispute that. I would seriously dispute that, considering what he said. So anyway. So you go back and he's just said, I don't believe he'd give me a hearing. Go back again. Well, I don't believe he'd give me a hearing. He would crush me with a storm. Oh, it is all the same, Job says. That is why I say he, God, destroys both the blameless and the wicked. That's unjust. He's accusing God of being unjust in Job 9, verse 22. Well, then God shows up. The Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Oh, by the way, let's go back. Verse 17 of Job 9. God would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason. Well, guess who shows up in a storm? God does, okay? He said, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Describe for me the Lord's frame of mind at this point.
If you think you're so smart, stand up and take it like a man.
Yeah, take it like a man. Brace yourself.
Yeah.
But at least God's talking to him now, and he's been praying to God, and God was answering.
So like that, bring it on.
Has Job been praying? Has he addressed anything to God?
Well, he's not in that,
Not in my reading of the passages. He's been talking to his friends, so-called, about God.
but I'm thinking of privately, I'll bet he was praying.
Maybe, but it's not in the story. I'm not going to add more to the story than there is. And we might have touched on something that may have been a weakness of Job's, is that he directed he knew God was overhearing it, but he didn't address his grievance directly to God. He was aggrieved to his friends, but he didn't turn and say, God, I need help. I don't read that anywhere in the text. That is another point that might be worth exploring sometime.
But he would pray before this all started happening to him. He would pray for his kids every day.
Well, sure.
Do sacrifices, all
Right.
sacrifices.
But interestingly, he did that while things were good.
They're good, right,
There's no record of him doing that when things got rotten.
He was probably hurt.
So that's a point. Okay? So anyway, yeah. Well, does the fact that God, what does that indicate that God spoke out of a storm?
I don't know, maybe that he heard that business.
Maybe he heard that earlier criticism. I'll tell you, he'd come in a storm just to crush me.
Yeah.
Well, we know the rest of the story, and Job lives, okay? So Job was not crushed. He was put in his place, but he wasn't crushed, okay? Interesting that storms quite often are the way God shows up when he wants to show his glory and his power. Can you think of a time when God showed up like that?
There is a passage or several passages in
Mm-hmm.
this book of Job where it tells you that God does direct the storm.
Yes.
And for different reasons, and
Mm-hmm.
he tells you some of the reasons.
In chapter 38 and 39 and the text today, he mentions some of that. But can you think of a time where it was like a storm when God showed up in his glory? I'm thinking of one, just leaps to mind. Very, very well-known incident. Mount Sinai, yes. Yes, Mount Sinai. It's billowing clouds of smoke and lightning and earthquakes. I mean, it was...
Well, anytime
God was in the storm.
he was obscured,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
just like when the temple was dedicated and all, he was always obscured.
Yes. In fact, it filled when the temple was dedicated for the first time, Solomon's temple, says that the priests could not come into the sanctuary. They could not get in because the glory of God filled the temple. Okay. Doesn't speak necessarily of a storm, but of his greatness and his holiness, yes. And that's clearly what's in here. I think that's what's going on here. God's coming in power. He's not going to come like, it's interesting how God does this, and I just thought of this. When Elijah was in the cave, hiding from Queen Jezebel, okay, who had threatened to kill him, and he had just done this magnificent job on Mount Carmel, another mountain, and God showed up and destroyed the altar and everything that was on the altar. Just fire from heaven consumed the altar and everything on it, while as Baal's servants, nothing happened. Okay. Elijah became very frightened when he heard that there was a hit out on his life, and he ran, basically, and hid out in a cave. How did God show up then? Because he did show up. And one time it said there was a storm.
Yeah, and other times it's just a little small voice, just a little,
God was not in the storm. It says he came in the wind, but God was not in the wind.
yeah.
He came as a still, small voice. God knows what we need. Now, it may not be all what we want, but it is what we need. And in this case, Job needed someone to bring him up short and remind him who he was. Well, remind him who he wasn't, who Job wasn't. God namely, okay? That he was not God. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. I wanted to share this with you. John Hartley wrote this. I'm sorry, I don't know who John Hartley is, but whoever he is, he's a smart guy. He said, Yahweh, that's the Lord here. Whenever you see the L-O-R-D again in all caps, that's the holy name of God, Yahweh. Okay. Yahweh, the wise teacher, takes the offensive and interrogates Job, his complaining servant. Job has pondered his dilemma from many sides, and his questioning has led him to challenge the traditional belief that God governs the world in justice. Without presenting a self-defense against these accusations, Yahweh opens by putting Job in his place with a question that casts doubt on Job's insight. Without discounting Job's moral integrity, Yahweh challenges Job's perception of the governance of the world, of his governance of the world. Job has not discerned the judicious counsel of God that permeates all of his deeds throughout the world. And although Job has lacked insight, Yahweh does not say that Job has sinned. He never rebukes Job for swearing his avowal of innocence. But he contends that Job's limited understanding hinders him from disputing wisely with his Creator about his own fate. Now, I want to reread that one because that one's a good one. That's loaded, okay? Listen to this. God contends that Job's limited understanding hinders him from disputing wisely with his Creator about his own fate. Job has not sought for the solution of his plight in God himself alone, but in the pursuit of his rights. In that search, he has erred. He was wrong. Job was looking to be justified by himself instead of finding his justification in God. He kept pointing, saying, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, when he should have found his security and the graciousness of God as his source of strength. But he looked inside instead of at God, who is the source of all strength. So, all right, well, here God, we're going to read most of chapter 38. It's good stuff. We won't read most of 39. In fact, we might touch a couple verses. Where were you, Job? Where were you? And notice the questions. Who, where, and who, and what, okay? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Well, with that question, Job is way off balance and out of his league, okay? Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. That's a really insightful look at the creation story, by the way, okay? Very inspired word from God himself on what happened at creation. That's great. The morning stars generally would refer to the angels, or perhaps seraphim, cherubim, okay? They're called stars sometimes in Hebrew. Anyway, but who measured it out? Were you there? Oh, Job, you weren't there. You know, it kind of goes without saying, right? Job was absent at creation. He was not present. So he doesn't know how the world was put together or its dimensions. By the way, the notion, verse 6, on what were its footings set, it was thought by ancients, it's really fascinating, because you read in one place where Job says that the earth exists on nothing. And here, the ancient notion that the earth was actually set on pillars, okay, that's an ancient notion, is actually seen to be supported here. But what God is doing is just speaking to what Job would understand, okay? He says, on what were its footings set? Who laid its cornerstone? Speaking of like a building that he built. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place. When I said, this far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt. Stopping, when he separated the waters from the waters, he personifies the raging waters. He placed them within borders, the shoreline. God said, you can go no further than this. That's the shoreline. That's as far as you can go. He controls the chaotic parts. God controls the chaotic parts of creation. The sea is seen as chaos. In fact, the sea is sometimes used as like the source of evil in the world. I prefer to say the source of chaos in the world, because the sea is untamed in so many respects. But even in the goodness of creation, there is some chaos, but God reminds him, but I control the chaos. I set the limits on what the waves can do and where they can go. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? Like, I love that picture. The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arm is broken. Very, very poetic, speaking of God's management of creation quite well, and he handles the wicked as he sees fit, not as Job sees fit or anybody else. He takes care of things in his time, in his way. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? From the gates of death, have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? In other words, have you been to these places? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. What is the way to the abode of light? Where's light live? And where does darkness reside? You know anything about that? Do you know where all that is? Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwellings? Surely you know, for you were already born. He's reminding Job, putting Job in his place. A little bit of sarcasm here, just to add a little edge. You have lived so many years. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? You get a little more insight. The stories of God's intervention in war, World War II, the ice and snow and bitter cold of the Russian winter when the Germans tried to stay in Russia. They were literally frozen out. Think God had a hand in that? Oh, I think so. You bet he did. It's part of the reason that evil empire was defeated, was because of the weather.
Korea was the same way.
Oh, was it? Was it? Okay.
Really bad cold.
Yeah, I mean, at times when it wasn't supposed to be that cold. Yeah. There are things, and again, these are insights from God himself. And what is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? You know, Job, your knowledge of things is incredibly limited. And we're going to keep going and talk about meteorology. He says, who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, and an uninhabited desert, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? Does the rain have a father? Who fathers the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the heavens? Imagine what the ancients must have thought. Of course, we have meteorologists and scientists to tell us how we get sleet and hail. Imagine the wonder, and you know, it's really too bad. Science is great. Science is great. I want to know as much as I can know. But there's a sense of wonder about hail to me, and snow, how every flake is unique, you know, that there's no two snowflakes alike. And who gives birth to those? Well, we know, we'll reduce it to science. We'll say, well, in the upper atmosphere, in the clouds, we have cold air, and hail is produced by raindrops that freeze and then are blown back up. And they are coated with more rain, and then they come back down, and then they're blown back up until they're so heavy they can't stop from coming down. So they come down as hail. Where did that come from? Job, do you know where that comes from? You know about all that stuff? And what about frost? What about frost? When the waters become hard as stone, where the surface of the deep is frozen. Who manages meteorology? It's certainly not Job. Can you bind the chain? Now he goes higher. Now he's out of the atmosphere. We're in outer space now. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear, that's Ursa Major and Minor, with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Oh, I like that. We're going to look at that in a minute. Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Laws of the heavens, that got me thinking. We're going to come back to that in a second. Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you? Here we are. Who gives the ibis wisdom, or gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clouds of earth stick together? Well, did you know that there are actually laws about space? There are scientific laws. I'll share a few. There are laws of celestial bodies. You can look it up yourself. Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Kepler was a brilliant mathematician as well as an astronomer, and he worked it out. I'm not even sure I understand it fully, but I know the concept. That there are certain, like the closer you get to the sun, the faster a planet moves. That's a law of planetary motion. It's like, have you ever seen these videos where they take marbles and you may have been to, I think they had it at the Amazeum. You take a quarter or a penny or something, and it'll start out like this. Then as it gets closer to the middle, it picks up speed, okay? That is Kepler's law of motion. So the closer you get to that middle point, the faster it moves. So planets nearest the sun move the most rapidly. That's Kepler's law of motion. That's a law of a celestial body, okay? And then there are others, like the idea that the Earth moves in ellipse around the sun. We do not go in a perfect orbit. It's not a circular orbit. It's an ellipse, and it can all be calculated mathematically. The laws of the heavens God made before we ever knew what they were, that there were laws in heaven. The only thing is about the ancients were relentless astronomers. They knew when the stars and the moon would show up and where they would show up in the sky. They knew that, like we don't know. We look on the calendar to find out about the moon, okay? They knew when the moon was coming. They knew. They kept track of that because that was the way of keeping time in relation to the year as it passed by. But Kepler's laws of planetary motion. So anyway, okay, just to show you the difficulty, here's one law of planetary motion. The square of the orbit, are you a math teacher, Christy? Maybe you can put it on a board. No, you don't want to do that. The square of the orbital period of a planet is proportional to the cube of the semi-major axis of its orbit. This relates the orbital period and distance of planets from the sun. It can actually be mathematically calculated. It's hard to understand. Well, is God smart? Boy, is he smart. You lost me. How about Newton's laws of universal gravitation? Every particle in the universe has a gravitational pull. The larger the body, the more the gravitational pull. Now, on Earth, we have the major gravitational pull is to the Earth itself. Some of us have had an unhappy experience with gravity. If you've been on a ladder, you know what I'm talking about. But the law of gravity is inviolable. It's always going to work that way. And since That's the major source of gravity, are being held to the earth like this. It's hard to feel any other gravitational pull. In the vacuum of space, it's another matter. And every body has a gravitational pull proportional to its size. Okay, so there's a law of universal gravitation. I've said this to this class before, and it still blows my mind to think that the earth is perfectly sized so that clouds do not evaporate into the heavens, nor do they come and flood us. But because the earth is perfectly sized, water vapor collects in clouds, get heavy, and then fall as rain periodically all over the earth. Instead of us being a dry planet or a planet covered with water, God has designed it in such a way, by the laws of universal gravitation, we don't flood. Well, except on rare occasion, but we do flood occasionally. But not completely. What I mean is where it would just, the clouds would just descend and stay, okay? That God separated. In fact, in creation, if you read carefully, He separated waters up here from down here. The waters in the firmament to the waters down here, okay? How about Newton's laws of motion? An object at rest stays at rest. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside force, what they call unbalanced force. Mm-hmm.
I had no idea what you said. It sounded
It is.
Okay, if you're sitting here, you're going to stay seated unless somebody pushes you.
Right.
And then
Or you
fall.
exercise, or you exert energy to remove yourself from that position.
That Bible is going to stay exactly the way
Right.
you had it until you apply a force on one end or the other.
Yes.
To close
Right.
it. And a force
The
is.
wind comes along, goes.
That's a wind. That's a source of energy. That's a force.
That's a force.
That's right.
Mhm.
That's right. And those that move, those things that move, tend to stay in motion unless acted on by an unbalanced force. The reason a paper airplane eventually falls is because the molecules of air that are in the air continue to bombard it as it flies and cause it friction, and it causes it to fall. Okay?
Let's just think of a football player running down the field. He's gonna keep going
Until,
somebody hits him, and
Right.
then he's gonna fall. over.
good idea. That great illustration. Yeah. Yeah,
Alley.
yeah.
That's right. He gets an alley from the defense.
There's also, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if you hit like this, your hand goes that way, okay? You've seen the dangling balls and the bowling balls that will, or however they do it. Sometimes they'll do them with balls as big as bowling balls. And that thing will go for a long time. And it illustrates the Newton laws of motion. Yeah, or a pool table, right. So, anyway, those are fundamental laws that affect the heavens. Well, God established those laws. He said He did. He set them up so that everything that we experience in life here on the earth and out in space are things that God has established, and we needed to discover it, and we did. So when people discover these things, it's always fascinating to me. It's almost like divine revelation. Oh, God, you're good. You did that. And we're continuing to learn more and more about that.
What irks me is that they're just walking in God's footsteps, and they're finding out what God has already done.
Yes,
And they congratulate themselves as if they had done it.
as if they've done it.
Yeah, they didn't do it.
All they did was discover it. They give awards for discovering it, not establishing the laws. Yeah, Jerry?
Christian Science, I heard one time, it said science keeps studying, eventually it'll catch up with the Bible.
Yeah. Maybe. Maybe. Oh my goodness. So,
The point that the Bible is accurate.
so what was God telling Job through all of this?
Your little peanut brain is quite good enough.
Your peanut brain, you're out of your league. Not even in the ballpark. You can't stand before me and tell me how to run the universe. But He did it in a way that he didn't point the finger at him. He laughed at him. Is what He was doing. He was chuckling, They'll say, how old you are, Job. Were you there? Oh, yeah, you were old. You're older than everybody. You were there. I mean, he does it. God has a great sense of humor and love for this man who suffered so. It's a wake up. He puts Job in his place in such a lovely way that Job really has nowhere to go except down on his knees.
You think that's maybe what God was trying to get all along?
Yeah.
He wasn't,
Yeah.
didn't go to God.
If he'd just gone to God about it, instead of talking about God, if he'd talked to God, Yeah. When Jesus suffered on the cross, he didn't talk about God. He talked to him. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I wonder how it would have turned out differently if Job had prayed like that. Why, God? Why? Instead of having a theological discussion, a long theological discussion with these guys that didn't know even as much as Job did. Well, Job, the Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? This is the closing remarks of his first speech. Let him who accuses God answer him. And then Job answered the Lord, like I said, the only way he could. He said, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. Is it wrong to wonder about our suffering? Yeah.
I mean, otherwise, why would Jesus have said,
My God, why?
And David, of course, he was quoting David.
Yes. So apparently David had an experience like that.
There's several of the Psalms where he just says, more or less, where are you? Why haven't you done anything?
When you get in so much pain, you can't hardly help it.
Yeah.
People just, they can't help it.
We're operating on emotion when we get into that much pain. This guy had lost everything. I mean, his life was turned upside down and emptied out. Yeah. So it's not wrong to wonder about it.
I hope it's not, because if it is, everybody would be
Yeah.
wrong whenever they get hurt.
I mentioned Elijah a moment ago, hiding out in a cave, suffering. I mean, he was afraid. And no, he did not. He did not condemn Job. He did not condemn Elijah. Of course, he did not condemn his own son. Elijah was not condemned. The Lord spoke softly to him and if you remember, Elijah had complained. He said, I don't get it. He said, they've seen this. They've seen these mighty acts that you performed on Mount Carmel, and here these unrighteous people are. He says, I am the only one left. He felt alone. But he wasn't the only one.
It's so funny about Elijah, he was so brave when he attacked those 400 priests, idolaters.
Yes.
But that one little wicked, weak woman, who couldn't
Yeah.
have fought her way out of a paper bag, he was terrified of her.
Well, she was a mighty powerful woman. She was, she'd been the terror of Israel for quite some time.
Yeah, because she was so wicked.
She was wicked, and
All through her husband.
she did. Well, she had an awful lot of power herself. She was well connected to other nations. She was a Sidonian. She was like the daughter of a king of Sidon. So, I mean, she had royal blood from other nations. She was a powerful woman in her own right, and through Ahab also, but still just a very formidable force to have to deal with. And fear can make you do crazy things and think crazy things. And also, I think Elijah had good reason to run.
Yeah, I do too, because she was
She put the word out, and he found out about it. Somebody came up to Elijah and said, Elijah, you're a wanted man. And they're not talking about wanted dead or alive. They're talking about wanted dead with a head on a stake or something like that. So yeah, and Elijah was at his wit's end and then said, Lord, I don't get it. This is not the way your word's supposed to work. And God did not scold him because he spoke to God. about it instead of talking about God to everybody else. It was different. He did not accuse God of doing wrong, of ruling unjustly. He just expressed his disillusionment with God. You know, his discouragement that things had gone so badly when he'd been so righteous. So, yeah, Job went a little deeper. Okay. Another question. What about this? Was Job guilty of sin? Did he sin in this thing? Did he sin? Okay, let me ask this question. Did he curse God? No. At no time, Satan loses this one. He loses this wager. Okay, he said that if he took everything away from him, that he'd curse God. He did not do that.
And his wife even encouraged him to
Yes.
God and died. And
Yeah.
But then it said that he, in spite of all this, he did not sin.
Right.
It said he did not sin.
That's right. It does say that. He did not. Yep.
And I think up until that point, maybe, and of course, I don't know if it's a totality that he never sinned at all throughout it.
Well, right.
But I wonder if, sort of playing the devil's advocate, I wonder if Job was basing his relationship to God on his own goodness, and if that's the case, maybe he was guilty possibly of religious pride.
Yeah.
Maybe.
He comes dangerously close to self-righteousness, doesn't he? We've mentioned that several times, Christy. I think you're on to something there. Yeah.
But that's why God chided him. I don't think God would have chided him even if he hadn't.
Yeah. He's not, if you'll notice, he's not chided for his sin. He's chided for his presumption that he knows how to run the world better than God does, or at least that God's not handling this like he'd like him to handle it.
And
Yeah.
I called God, he wouldn't come anyway.
Right.
You
Right.
know.
Well, if I called God, he would just crush me. Well, why don't you call on him instead of talking about it?
He was afraid to, he was afraid to get
God was standing by listening to every single word from all of these guys. He stood by silently, he let his name be dragged through the mud, if you will. Not cursed, but besmirched for sure. All that time, God allowed that to go on. Isn't that a little something? Doesn't that tell us something about God's justice in the world? Sometimes it waits.
And he's very patient.
He's long-suffering. Not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Yeah, most of the time, God does not inflict justice immediately. He gives people a chance to repent. He gave these guys a chance to repent till they just drilled themselves in a hole in the ground. They didn't know what to do.
I think that most of the things they said, his friends said, were true.
I think so.
Or God wouldn't have left them in the Bible.
I-
But they were applying their truth incorrectly.
Okay.
Because they were assuming that Job must have sinned when he hadn't.
Okay.
And so they were just applying their truths incorrectly.
Their box, their template of understanding was wrong. Their template of understanding was wrong. I think that's a great danger for all of us as believers. That's the next great sin, is that we put God in this box and we say, okay, God, you're supposed to act like this, but here I am suffering. Here's this situation. I don't get it. This does not agree with my notion of you. That's our problem, by the way. That's not God's problem. That's our problem.
God cannot be put in a box.
No, and he's the creator. We are the creation. Do we have any idea how different those two entities are? We don't know. We don't, because we have not seen God in all of his glory face to face with our own eyes yet.
You can just think of everything he's done. And I mean, how can he do all that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's so amazing that he can do all that, everything that he's done. That right there ought to tell you something.
God's defense is pretty powerful. Well, it's ultimately powerful. I mean, there's no answering any of this. He does not tell. I think what's notable is, what didn't God say?
Yeah.
Well, I'm asking, what didn't God's, what?
He didn't say, I had a bet on with the devil.
Right, I had a bet with the devil.
That
Right,
was just-
I had a bet with the devil. He didn't say that.
He never told me the cause.
No, he never told him the cause.
He just said
No,
that and Job
no.
went in prison.
God never copped to anything, actually, if you want to know the truth.
He never answered him at all.
No, his answer was completely, no, I'm not, he didn't tell him nothing. He didn't say, I'm not telling you anything. He just went on and told him, you haven't even got the right to ask. You have no standing.
Well, and Job truly repented as far as what he said. I spoke, but I don't have the right to even come
Right. The appropriate response
yeah.
to the answer he got.
He was penitent and
Yep, there's nothing to say because he had no answer, not even for one question. Completely, yeah, and neither do we. Yeah, yeah. And understand, the first couple of weeks we talked about Job's suffering, and I felt like I had a whole lot more compassion for Job than now when we get to the end of this, near the end of the study, and say, well, they've mulled this over and debated it and talked about it and turned it over so many times and cooked it till it was hard. And I mean, till we burned it, what are we going to do with it now? And you say, well, Job, I'm getting impatient. Well, understand, he was still sick. He was still bereaved. He was still broke. He was all that.
No support system.
And no support system other than these friends who,
And they,
oh,
or they wouldn't have stayed with it as
Yeah.
silly man
Yeah.
for a week.
yeah. But Job is obviously shocked by his own lack of standing. He's shocked. He said, I can't speak a word. When God speaks, he always has the last word,
I'm always reminded Jesus did the same thing in certain cases.
Yeah,
He answered, ask a question, full question.
that's right. That's right. Jesus never felt like he had to explain himself. We were talking about this Sunday morning in class about the parables, how the parables were designed to weed out people who would hear him and those who would not. Those who didn't want to understand, no amount of explaining would have done. They would not have understood it. He gave very little. That's right. And he spent no time messing with people that he knew weren't going to listen. If they attacked him, it depends on the situation. If they attacked him publicly, he'd answer it, but he wouldn't spend a lot of time on it. So, yeah. God didn't have to defend himself. That ought to tell us something. God didn't have to defend himself.
And a lot of Jesus' teaching was veiled by the parables.
Sure.
Were veiling of
Sure.
the lesson.
Yes.
For this. He didn't
Yep.
want the bad people necessarily to get it.
Look at James, the inspired writer. I love, this is the only mention of Job in the New Testament. We count as blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. They knew the story. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Now, this is in the context of those who have persevered through suffering, and he says, but the Lord is full of kindness and mercy. How was the Lord merciful to Job?
Well, he gave everything back to him that he.
Well, later, yeah, he did later,
God
yes.
is merciful for not zapping him.
For not zapping him right then.
Yeah, I'll show you who's in
Yeah.
charge.
He didn't owe Job a word about anything.
Because God could just as easily have been a dictatorial God. He
Sure.
didn't have to be a compassionate,
No.
merciful.
A compassionate and merciful God spoke to Job.
And if he'd been dictatorial, we'd have all been.
Well, right. This tells us something about God's nature. He is so far beyond us. He's already told us how far beyond us he is. And yet he took the time to speak to one of his creation at length about his own greatness and how how Job was unqualified to judge anybody, him least of all, about the reasons for his suffering. So, anyway, sometimes you just have to persevere. Job did. Job did. He grumbled and he complained and he questioned God's justice, but The Holy Spirit said he persevered. He was not, and he didn't sin in all that he did. He didn't sin. Somebody says, I get quite often asked it, is it all right to tell God that you're not happy with the decision he's made?
You might as well tell him.
Well, yeah, because he knows it anyway. He knows when you're happy. You might as well be honest. Yeah, Christy?
I remember years ago when I found out I couldn't have children, I remember being mad at God.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I had a prayer. I was lying on my back. I mean, I remember even where I was. It was in Fort Smith. God, I kept myself pure until marriage, and this is the
Thanks I
punishment
get.
Well, I mean, I realized, oh my gosh, I just backtalked God. I mean, I hopped out of that bed and got on my hands and said, I'm so sorry, God, I'll never talk to you like that again. But I said it, and then I realized he could zap me dead right now.
Mm-hmm. He
And
could.
like I said, I hopped out of that bed faster than lightning and got on my hands and said, I'm so sorry, I won't ever say
Yeah.
anything like that again. And I never have. But I thought to myself, God allowed me to get that out of my system. But then I realized he didn't have, nothing in the Bible promised me I could have kids.
Yeah.
There was nothing about that. And of course, now that, you know, the events in my life that happened, God had a plan all along.
He was working
There
it.
was a reason for that. I just didn't understand it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember that event, and boy, I mean, I got out on my hands and knees out of that bed and on my hands and knees quickly.
I think sometimes the Holy Spirit points out to us things that we need to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like I said, I've never ever talked to God like that again, but I did that one time. And, yeah.
There was you brought up a very important word in your own story. Let's see, where was it? Was it the beginning of the text? Hang on, I'm going to go back. Verse 2.
Yeah.
Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? In other words, that's a nice way of saying, who's trying to mess up my plans? You ignoramus, you. You have no clue what you're doing.
Because God can see the end from the beginning, and he knows exactly what
Yeah.
needs to be done.
Yeah.
We don't.
Yeah, notice there was not a cute little illustration that God gave before he laid into Job. He just laid right into him and said, you don't know anything. You're just obscuring my plans. You don't know. You have no idea what you're talking about. And we have to find our purpose and our strength in him when we suffer. He did. He did. And that shows you something of the man he was. That's the kind of man he was. That's why James, the Spirit through James, commended Job as a man of perseverance. Yes, because in the end, of course, God blessed him, but in the end, his faith was more than intact. It was stronger than it had ever been. Now it was no longer, God, I'm serving you because everything always goes well for me. Now I'm serving you because I love you. Man, that's a hard lesson to learn.
And how great you really are.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's the only way we learn it. All right, we'll see you next week. We'll do it all again. And then tomorrow at the community lunch, if you can make it.